The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Clarence's house as Charles stood before his mirror, adjusting his tie with trembling fingers. Today would mark the end of everything he had secretly cherished for months. The official announcement had been made 3 days ago, and now the inevitable moment had arrived. Camilla was leaving for Australia, taking a position with a prestigious law firm in Sydney. What the press didn't know, what no one suspected, was the quiet romance that had blossomed between them over the past year. Charles had met Camilla at a charity function the previous spring. She wasn't part of the royal circle, wasn't seeking attention or favors. She was simply there, representing her legal firm's pro bono work with homeless shelters. Her laugh had caught his attention first, genuine and unguarded, so different from the careful, practiced responses he usually encountered. When they were introduced, she had looked him directly in the eyes and asked about his opinions on housing policy, rather than commenting on the weather or royal protocols. Their friendship had developed slowly, carefully. Secret coffee meetings in quiet corners of London, long walks through Hyde Park when his security detail could be convinced to maintain a discreet distance, and late-night phone conversations that stretched until dawn. Charles found himself sharing thoughts and dreams he had never voiced to another soul. Camilla listened without judgment, challenged his ideas with intelligence, and made him feel like a man rather than a title. The relationship had remained platonic, both understanding the impossible nature of anything more. Charles was bound by duty, tradition, and the expectations of an entire nation. Camilla was a commoner with her own ambitions and no desire to be thrust into the spotlight of royal scrutiny. Yet something deep and meaningful had grown between them, something that made the approaching separation feel like a physical wound. His private secretary knocked on the door, reminding him of the morning's schedule. There would be a brief appearance at a veterans' hospital, followed by lunch with members of Parliament, and then the dreaded afternoon farewell reception. The reception was officially to honor several distinguished citizens who were relocating abroad for professional opportunities. Camilla would be among them, receiving recognition for her legal work and accepting best wishes for her new position. To everyone else, it would be a routine royal duty. To Charles, it would be goodbye to the woman who had become his closest confidant and the keeper of his heart. As he made his way through the morning's obligations, Charles found his mind constantly drifting to memories of their time together. He remembered the afternoon she had accompanied him on an unofficial visit to a struggling community center. While he performed his expected role, greeting volunteers and posing for photographs, Camilla had quietly slipped away to speak with the children. He had found her later, sitting on the floor in the corner, helping a young boy with his reading. She hadn't noticed Charles watching, hadn't performed for his benefit. She had simply been herself, kind and present and real. During lunch with the MPs, Charles struggled to maintain his usual diplomatic demeanor. The conversation flowed around him. Budget discussions, policy debates, ceremonial matters. But his thoughts remained fixed on the woman who would soon be 12,000 miles away. One of the ministers commented on his distracted air, joking that His Royal Highness seemed to have his mind on other matters. Charles managed a polite smile and redirected the conversation, but inside he felt as though he were slowly drowning. The afternoon reception was held in the grand ballroom of St. James's Palace. Dignitaries, diplomats, and honored guests mingled beneath crystal chandeliers, their conversations creating a gentle hum that filled the ornate space. Charles moved through the crowd with practiced ease, offering congratulations and expressing the Crown's appreciation for their various contributions to British society. But his eyes kept searching for Camilla. When he finally saw her, his breath caught in his throat. She wore a simple navy dress that highlighted her grace without calling unnecessary attention. Her hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence he had always admired. She was speaking with the Australian High Commissioner, no doubt discussing her upcoming relocation and new position. From across the room, she looked composed and excited about her future. But Charles knew her well enough to notice the slight tension around her eyes. The way she held her shoulders just a fraction too straight. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and for a moment, the noise and movement around them seemed to fade into background static. Camilla offered him a small, private smile, the same smile she had given him during their quiet walks, during their late-night conversations, during all the stolen moments they had shared. It was a smile that said everything they couldn't speak aloud in this public setting. Charles made his way toward her, stopping to acknowledge other guests along the route, but never losing sight of his destination. The protocol required him to speak with each honoree, to offer official congratulations and best wishes. When he finally reached Camilla, she was alone, having finished her conversation with the High Commissioner. "Miss Parker," he said formally, using her surname as required by the setting and the watching eyes around them. "Your Royal Highness," she replied, offering a perfectly appropriate curtsy. But when she straightened and looked at him again, Charles saw everything she couldn't say reflected in her expression. The shared regret, the acknowledgement of what they were losing, the brave attempt to smile through the pain of parting. Around them, the reception continued, guests enjoying champagne and canapé while making polite conversation about careers and opportunities. None of them suspected that they were witnessing the beginning of the most difficult goodbye either Charles or Camilla would ever have to make. The conversation between Charles and Camilla at the reception remained painfully formal, each word carefully chosen for the ears of those nearby. They discussed her new position, the climate in Sydney, the opportunities for international legal work. To anyone observing, it appeared to be nothing more than a polite exchange between a member of the royal family and a distinguished citizen. But beneath the surface of their diplomatic words ran a current of emotion so strong that Charles worried others might sense it. "I'm sure you'll find Australia quite agreeable," Charles said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "The legal community there is highly regarded. Thank you, Your Royal Highness." "I'm looking forward to the new challenges," Camilla replied, though her eyes betrayed the cost of maintaining such composure. They were interrupted by the arrival of other guests seeking to pay their respects to Charles, and Camilla gracefully stepped aside. She spent the remainder of the reception speaking with various dignitaries and officials, accepting their congratulations and answering questions about her upcoming departure. Charles watched her from across the room as he fulfilled his own obligations, noting how she maintained her poise even as the afternoon wore on. As the reception drew to a close, Charles found himself in conversation with a group of ambassadors near the main entrance. He could see Camilla gathering her things, preparing to leave with the other honored guests. His heart began to race as he realized this might be their final moment together. The ambassadors were discussing trade agreements, but their words became mere background noise as Charles watched Camilla make her way toward the exit. She paused near the doorway, turning back to scan the room one final time. When her gaze found his, she offered a small nod of farewell. It was the kind of gesture any polite guest might make when leaving a royal function, but Charles understood it as something far more significant. He managed a brief nod in return, though every fiber of his being wanted to cross the room and speak with her privately one last time. That evening, Charles sat alone in his study at Clarence House, staring at the telephone on his desk. He had dismissed his staff early, claiming the need for solitude to review some documents. In reality, he was wrestling with an almost overwhelming desire to call Camilla. He knew she would be at home, probably packing for her departure the following week. He imagined her moving through her flat, carefully folding clothes and deciding which books to take and which to leave behind. The phone seemed to mock him with its silence. How many times over the past months had he lifted that receiver to hear her voice, to share a thought or simply to wish her good night? Those conversations had become the highlight of his days, the moments when he could set aside his public persona and simply be himself. Now the weight of protocol and propriety held his hand back from reaching for the phone one final time. Instead, he opened the drawer of his desk and withdrew a small photograph. It had been taken during their visit to the community center, captured by one of his security detail without Charles realizing it at the time. The photo showed him and Camilla standing side by side, watching the children play in the garden. They weren't touching, weren't even looking at each other, but something about their posture, the way they stood naturally close together, spoke of an intimacy that transcended physical contact. The following days passed in a blur of official duties and private anguish. Charles attended a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new hospital wing, hosted a dinner for visiting dignitaries, and reviewed documents related to various charitable organizations. But through it all, he carried the knowledge that Camilla was preparing to leave, that each passing hour brought their final separation closer. 3 days before her scheduled departure, Charles received an unexpected phone call. His private secretary informed him that Miss Parker had requested a brief audience to discuss a legal matter related to one of his charitable foundations. Charles felt his pulse quicken as he agreed to the meeting, though he wondered what legal issue could possibly require Camilla's attention when she was about to leave the country. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon. At Clarence House, Charles spent the morning in a state of nervous anticipation, reviewing files related to his various charitable endeavors in an attempt to identify what legal matter might need Camilla's expertise. But as the appointed time approached, he began to suspect that the legal consultation was merely a pretense, a way for them to have one final private conversation. When Camilla arrived, she was escorted to Charles's private office by his secretary, who then discreetly withdrew. For the first time since the reception, they were alone together. The formal distance they had maintained in public seemed suddenly unnecessary and painful. "Thank you for seeing me," Camilla said, setting her briefcase on the chair beside her but not opening it. "Of course," Charles replied, though they both knew this meeting had nothing to do with legal advice. They stood facing each other across the room, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. Charles noted how she looked tired, as though she hadn't been sleeping well. Her usual composure remained intact, but he could see the strain around her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands as she smoothed her skirt. "I wanted to," Camilla began, then stopped, seeming to search for the right words. "I wanted to say goodbye properly." The reception was so formal, so public. It didn't feel like a real farewell. Charles nodded, understanding completely. The official ceremony had been a performance for both of them, a carefully choreographed dance around their true feelings. "I'm glad you came," he said simply. They talked for nearly an hour, carefully avoiding any direct acknowledgement of their feelings while somehow managing to express everything that needed to be said. They spoke of her excitement about the new position, her nervousness about starting over in a new country. Charles shared his upcoming travel schedule, his commitment to various causes that she had shown interest in during their friendship. As their conversation drew to a close, both seemed reluctant to end what they knew would be their final private moment together. The afternoon light was beginning to fade outside the windows, casting long shadows across the room. Soon Camilla would have to leave, and their connection would become nothing more than memory. The silence stretched between them as both Charles and Camilla seemed to realize that their time together was drawing to an end. Outside the windows of Clarence House, London continued its eternal rhythm, but inside the private office, time felt suspended. Charles stood near his desk, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that had become habitual during moments of internal struggle. Camilla remained by the chair where she had placed her briefcase, though neither of them had made any pretense of conducting actual legal business. "I should go," Camilla finally said, though she made no move toward her briefcase or the door. "Yes," Charles agreed, though his voice carried no conviction. Instead of leaving, Camilla walked to the window that overlooked the garden. Charles had spent countless hours at that same window, often thinking of her during their times apart. Now she stood there, her reflection ghost-like in the glass as the afternoon light continued to fade. "I used to imagine what your life was like," she said quietly, still facing the window. "Before we became friends, I mean. I thought it must be lonely sometimes being surrounded by people, but having to maintain such careful distance from everyone." Charles moved to stand beside her at the window, close enough to catch the subtle scent of her perfume, far enough to maintain propriety should anyone enter unexpectedly. "It was lonely," he admitted, "until I met you." It was perhaps the most direct acknowledgement either of them had made of what their relationship meant. Camilla turned from the window to look at him, and Charles saw tears gathering in her eyes despite her composed expression. "This is impossible, isn't it?" she asked. "What we feel for each other, what we've become to one another. It's completely impossible." Charles wanted to argue, to find some way to contradict her, but honesty compelled him to nod. "Completely impossible," he agreed, "and completely real." They stood looking at each other, both understanding that this moment represented a crossroads they had been approaching for months. There was no future for them together, no way to bridge the gap between his royal obligations and her need for a life of her own choosing. Yet the connection between them had grown too strong to simply dismiss or forget. "I need to tell you something," Camilla said, her voice barely above a whisper. The position in Australia. It wasn't my first choice. I had other offers, opportunities that would have kept me in London. I chose Sydney because I knew that staying here, seeing you at functions and events, watching you from a distance while pretending we were nothing more than acquaintances, I knew it would destroy us both. Charles felt as though she had reached into his chest and grasped his heart. The sacrifice she was making became clear to him in that moment. She wasn't just pursuing a career opportunity. She was saving them both from the slow torment of an impossible situation. Camilla, he began, but she raised her hand to stop him. Don't, she said gently. Don't make this harder than it already is. We both know what we would say to each other if circumstances were different. We both know what we feel. Saying it aloud won't change anything except to make the leaving more painful. But Charles couldn't remain silent. The words had been building inside him for months, growing stronger with each shared conversation, each moment of understanding, each laugh they had exchanged. I need you to know, he said, his voice rough with emotion, that this year, knowing you, being your friend, has been the happiest of my life. Tears spilled over onto Camilla's cheeks, though she continued to smile. Mine too, she whispered. They stood in silence again, both struggling with the magnitude of what they were losing. Outside, the first streetlights were beginning to flicker on as London prepared for evening. Inside, two people who had found something precious and rare were preparing to say goodbye to it forever. I should really go now, Camilla said, wiping away her tears with the back of her hand. If I stay much longer, I'm going to lose my courage entirely. She moved toward her briefcase, but Charles caught her arm gently. Wait, he said. There's something I want you to have. He walked to his desk and opened the bottom drawer, withdrawing a small wrapped package. It was clearly a book, thin and rectangular, wrapped in simple brown paper with no ribbon or decoration. I know you love poetry, he said, offering her the package. This is a first edition of Rupert Brooke. I hoped you might think of England sometimes when you're in Australia, and remember that there are people here who care about you. Camilla accepted the gift with trembling hands. Charles, I can't take this. A first edition must be incredibly valuable. Its value is in the giving, he replied. Please, let me know that you have it, that something of England travels with you. She held the book against her chest as though it were something infinitely precious. Thank you, she said. I'll treasure it always. The moment had come when further delay would only increase their pain. Camilla gathered her briefcase and moved toward the door, with Charles following at a respectful distance. They both understood that once she left this room, their relationship would revert to the formal, distant connection appropriate between a member of the royal family and a citizen. There would be no more private conversations, no more shared laughter, no more moments of genuine intimacy. At the door, Camilla paused with her hand on the handle. She turned back to Charles, and for a moment, the careful control she had maintained throughout their friendship seemed about to crumble. Her lip trembled and fresh tears threatened to spill down her cheeks. I wish, she began, then stopped herself. No, I don't wish anything were different. What we've had has been perfect in its own way, pure and honest and real. I wouldn't change a moment of it, even knowing how it has to end. Charles felt his own composure slipping. Nor would I, he managed to say. They looked at each other one final time, memorizing details, storing up images to carry with them through the years ahead. Then Camilla opened the door and stepped out into the hallway, where Charles's secretary waited to escort her from the building. Charles remained in his office doorway, watching as she walked away down the corridor. She didn't look back, and he was grateful for her strength. At the far end of the hall, she disappeared around the corner, taking with her the light that had illuminated the past year of his life. 2 days passed in a haze of routine obligations and private torment. Charles attended a ceremony at Westminster Abbey, participated in a meeting with education ministers, and reviewed plans for upcoming state visits. To everyone around him, he appeared to function normally, perhaps a bit quieter than usual, but still fulfilling his duties with his characteristic attention to detail. Only Charles knew how much effort it required to maintain this facade, while his heart felt as though it were slowly tearing apart. On the morning of Camilla's departure, Charles woke before dawn and found himself unable to return to sleep. He dressed and walked through the empty corridors of Clarence House, eventually finding himself in the conservatory where he and Camilla had once shared tea during one of her visits. The morning light filtered through the glass panels, creating patterns on the floor that reminded him of that afternoon when she had laughed at something he said, the sound filling the space with warmth and joy. His flight to Edinburgh wasn't until late afternoon. The trip had been planned months ago, a routine visit to several Scottish charities and a dinner with local dignitaries. Originally, the timing had seemed unremarkable. Now, Charles realized with bitter irony that he would be thousands of feet in the air, flying away from London at almost the exact moment Camilla's plane departed for Sydney. They would be traveling in opposite directions, putting continents between them. The morning brought a steady stream of visitors and meetings. Charles met with representatives from various organizations, reviewed correspondence, and approved plans for future engagements. His staff noted his subdued mood but attributed it to the early hour and busy schedule. None of them knew that their composed, dutiful prince was counting down the hours until the woman he loved would be gone forever. At 11 o'clock, his private secretary knocked on his office door. "Your Royal Highness, there's been a slight change to your Edinburgh schedule. The dinner tonight has been moved back by an hour to accommodate the Lord Provost's availability." Charles nodded his acknowledgement, though the information barely registered. All he could think about was Camilla, probably at her flat making final preparations for her journey. He wondered if she was nervous, excited, or simply numb with the pain of leaving. He wondered if she was thinking of him. Lunch was a solitary affair in his private dining room. Charles picked at his food, finding it difficult to swallow past the tightness in his throat. The grandfather clock in the corner marked each passing minute with relentless precision. By his calculations, Camilla would be leaving for Heathrow Airport within the next few hours. At 2:30, Charles departed for his own journey to Scotland. His car moved through London traffic while his mind remained fixed on thoughts of Camilla. Somewhere in this same city, she was preparing to leave everything familiar behind. The knowledge that he would never again have the possibility of seeing her, even by chance, felt like a physical wound. Heathrow Airport buzzed with its usual chaos of travelers, announcements, and bustling activity. Charles's plane was being prepared for departure from a private terminal, away from the crowds and photographers. As he waited in the VIP lounge, he found himself staring out the window at the passenger terminals in the distance. Camilla would be somewhere among those buildings, going through security, finding her gate, preparing to board the flight that would take her away from him forever. At 4:15, Charles received clearance to board his aircraft. As he settled into his seat and the plane began to taxi toward the runway, he checked his watch. Camilla's flight was scheduled to depart in 30 minutes. Soon they would both be airborne, traveling away from each other at hundreds of miles per hour. The plane lifted off smoothly, London shrinking below them as they climbed toward cruising altitude. Charles pressed his face to the window, watching the city become a patchwork of lights and shadows in the afternoon haze. Somewhere down there, Camilla's plane was probably taxiing for takeoff. In a few minutes, she too would be looking down at London, perhaps thinking of him as he was thinking of her. As the plane leveled off and began its journey north toward Scotland, Charles closed his eyes and tried to imagine Camilla's experience. She would be settled in her seat by now, probably with a book open in her lap, though he doubted she would be able to concentrate on reading. The flight to Sydney would take over 20 hours with connections. 20 hours of travel to reach her new life, while his own journey to Edinburgh would be completed in less than 2. His aide approached with a briefing folder containing information about the evening's dinner and the following day's activities. Charles accepted the folder but didn't open it immediately. Instead, he found himself calculating time zones, wondering what time it would be in Sydney when he arrived in Edinburgh, how many hours ahead of him Camilla would be living her new life. The Scottish countryside spread out below as they began their descent into Edinburgh. Charles had always loved the rolling hills and ancient castles of Scotland, but today the landscape seemed muted, colorless. Even the most beautiful views in the world couldn't lift the weight of loss that had settled in his chest. Upon landing, Charles was met by local officials and transported to his hotel. The Lord Provost greeted him warmly, discussing the evening's dinner and the various dignitaries who would be in attendance. Charles responded appropriately, asking relevant questions and expressing interest in the charitable organizations they would be supporting. But part of his mind remained fixed on Camilla, now somewhere over European airspace, flying farther from him with each passing minute. The hotel suite was elegant and comfortable, overlooking Edinburgh Castle in the distance. Charles stood at the window as his staff unpacked his belongings and prepared for the evening's event. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ancient city. In a few hours he would attend dinner, make appropriate remarks, and fulfill his obligations with his usual grace. Tomorrow he would visit the charities, meet with local officials, and continue the work that defined his public life. But tonight, as he prepared for the evening ahead, Charles allowed himself one final moment of private grief for what he was losing. Somewhere over the Middle East or Asia, Camilla was traveling toward her new life. By the time he returned to London, she would be settled in Sydney, beginning to establish routines and relationships that would have nothing to do with him. The knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. His valet had arrived to help him dress for dinner. Charles turned away from the window and began the familiar ritual of preparing for a public appearance. As he adjusted his tie and straightened his jacket, he made a silent promise to himself. He would carry the memory of his time with Camilla like a treasured possession, something private and precious that would sustain him through the lonely years ahead. Their love had been impossible, but it had also been real and pure and transformative. That would have to be enough. 3 months had passed since Camilla's departure, and Charles had settled into a routine that allowed him to function while carefully avoiding anything that might trigger memories of their time together. He had thrown himself into his charitable work with renewed intensity, scheduling more visits, more meetings, more opportunities to focus on the needs of others, rather than his own sense of loss. His staff attributed his increased activity to admirable dedication, never suspecting it was actually a form of emotional survival. The autumn weather in London had turned crisp and gray, matching Charles's internal landscape. He had just returned from a week-long tour of Wales, visiting communities affected by mine closures and meeting with local organizations working to revitalize their economies. The work had been satisfying and important, but the long hours and constant travel had left him exhausted. Sitting in his study at Clarence House, Charles was reviewing correspondence when his private secretary knocked on the door. "Your Royal Highness, there's a call for you from Australia. A Miss Jennifer Walsh from Davidson, Walsh & Associates in Sydney. She says it's regarding legal matters for one of your charitable foundations." Charles felt his heart skip a beat. Davidson, Walsh & Associates was the firm where Camilla had taken her position. Though he tried to convince himself this was merely a coincidence, that the call concerned routine legal business, he couldn't suppress the hope that somehow this might provide news of her. "Put the call through," he instructed, attempting to keep his voice steady. Miss Walsh introduced herself as a senior partner at the firm, explaining that she was calling about a potential legal issue involving one of Charles's housing charities. A former resident of one of their supported accommodations had made serious allegations about conditions and treatment and was threatening to pursue action through the courts. The matter required delicate handling to protect both the residents and the charity's reputation. "I understand that one of my colleagues, Camilla Parker, previously provided some advice to your organization," Miss Walsh continued. "Given her familiarity with your foundation's work, I was hoping she might be able to assist with this matter even though she's still settling into her role here." Charles's pulse quickened. "Miss Parker is working on this case? She's reviewing the files as we speak, Your Royal Highness. In fact, she specifically requested to handle this matter when she learned it involved your foundation. She has considerable expertise in housing law, and her previous knowledge of your organization's work makes her the ideal person to represent your interests." After ending the call and making arrangements for the necessary documents to be forwarded to Sydney, Charles sat alone in his study staring at the telephone. Camilla was working on his behalf, reviewing legal documents that bore his name, protecting an organization he cared deeply about. The thought that she was thinking of him professionally, even if not personally, provided a strange mixture of comfort and renewed longing. Over the following days, Charles found himself checking his correspondence more frequently, hoping for updates on the legal matter. When reports finally arrived from Sydney, they bore Camilla's name at the bottom of detailed analyses and recommendations. Her work was thorough and insightful, demonstrating the same intelligence and attention to detail that had first impressed him during their personal conversations. The case progressed over several weeks, requiring numerous exchanges of documents and communications between London and Sydney. Though all correspondence came through the law firm's official channels, Charles found himself studying every document for some sign of Camilla's personal touch, some indication that she remembered their connection. One afternoon, a package arrived by special courier from Sydney. Inside were the final legal documents resolving the housing charity dispute, along with a comprehensive report on policies the organization might implement to prevent similar issues in the future. Camilla's recommendations were brilliant, addressing not only the immediate legal concerns but also suggesting improvements that would benefit the residents and strengthen the charity's mission. At the bottom of the report, in what appeared to be a handwritten note, was a brief personal message. Your Royal Highness, it has been an honor to work on behalf of an organization that does such important work for vulnerable populations. The dedication and compassion evident in your foundation's mission is truly inspiring. I hope these recommendations prove useful in continuing your valuable service to those in need. Respectfully, C. Parker. Charles read and reread the note, searching for hidden meaning in every carefully chosen word. The message was completely professional and appropriate, but something in its tone suggested warmth beyond mere legal formality. She had taken the time to add a personal note, to acknowledge not just the legal work but the humanitarian mission behind it. In her own careful way, she was reaching across the distance between them. That evening, Charles drafted a formal letter of thanks to Davidson, Walsh and Associates, expressing his gratitude for their excellent work on behalf of his charity. He spent considerable time composing the letter, knowing it would be forwarded to Camilla among others. In his final paragraph he wrote, "Please extend my particular appreciation to Miss Parker for her exceptional analysis and recommendations. Her insights will undoubtedly benefit the residents we serve for years to come. Her commitment to justice and her understanding of the human impact of legal decisions reflect the highest ideals of the legal profession." The letter was formal and appropriate, but Charles hoped Camilla would understand the deeper appreciation it conveyed. Through the language of professional courtesy, he was telling her that her work mattered to him, that her contribution to something he cared about had touched him personally. Winter had settled over London by the time Charles received a response to his letter. It came in the form of a brief note from Miss Walsh, thanking him for his kind words and informing him that the entire team, including Miss Parker, had been pleased by his appreciation of their work. The note mentioned that Miss Parker had expressed particular satisfaction in knowing that her recommendations would help protect vulnerable residents. As Charles filed the correspondence away, he found himself wondering about Camilla's life in Sydney. Was she happy? Had she made friends? Did she ever think of their walks through Hyde Park, or their long conversations about poetry and politics? The professional contact had provided a glimpse into her new world, but it had also intensified his sense of the distance between them. Looking out his window at the London skyline, gray and cold under winter clouds, Charles tried to imagine the Australian summer that Camilla was experiencing. The seasons were reversed there, just as their lives had taken opposite directions. She was beginning something new while he continued in patterns established long before they met. Yet somehow, through the impersonal medium of legal documents and professional correspondence, they had managed to touch each other's lives again, even if only briefly. The connection was tenuous and might never be repeated, but it had been real. For a few weeks they had worked together again, their minds focused on solving problems and helping people, just as they had during the best moments of their friendship. It wasn't the relationship Charles longed for, but it was something, a reminder that the bond they had formed hadn't been entirely severed by distance and impossibility. Spring arrived in London with unusual warmth and brightness, as though nature itself was attempting to lift the melancholy that had settled over the city during the long winter months. Charles found himself more active than usual, accepting additional engagements and extending his involvement with various charitable organizations. His staff attributed this increased energy to the improving weather, but Charles knew it was something deeper, a growing acceptance of his circumstances and a determination to find meaning in the life that duty required him to live. It was during a visit to a rehabilitation center in South London that Charles received news that would change everything. He was speaking with a group of young people who were working to overcome addiction when his private secretary approached with an urgent message. There had been an incident involving one of his charities in Sydney, and immediate consultation with legal counsel was required. The details were sparse but concerning. A fire had broken out at a housing facility that Charles's foundation helped support through an international partnership. While no one had been seriously injured, questions were being raised about safety protocols and building standards. The Australian media was beginning to take interest, and there were hints that the incident might become a larger story about British charitable organizations operating overseas. Within hours, Charles was back at Clarence House, participating in an emergency conference call with officials from both London and Sydney. The situation was more complex than initially reported. The fire had been relatively minor, but it had exposed some maintenance issues that could potentially affect the foundation's reputation and, more importantly, its ability to continue helping vulnerable populations in Australia. "We need someone who understands both British charitable law and Australian housing regulations," explained the foundation's director. "This isn't just a legal matter. It's about ensuring we can continue our mission while meeting all applicable standards." There was a pause in the conversation before someone from Sydney spoke up. "Davidson, Walsh and Associates has been recommended by several sources. They handled a similar matter for another British organization last year, with excellent results. We could have initial consultations begun immediately." Charles felt his pulse quicken, but he kept his voice steady. "That seems reasonable. Please proceed with engaging their services." What followed was perhaps the most intense period of Charles's charitable career. The Sydney incident had highlighted systemic issues that required comprehensive review of all international partnerships. For weeks, Charles worked closely with legal teams in both countries, reviewing policies, analyzing procedures, and developing new standards for overseas operations. Camilla's involvement in the case became apparent within days. Her signature appeared on legal analyses, her insights shaped strategic recommendations, and her expertise guided the foundation through the complex process of satisfying both British and Australian regulatory requirements. Though all communication remained strictly professional, channeled through official representatives, Charles found himself eagerly anticipating each report and update that bore evidence of her work. The collaboration intensified when it became clear that Charles himself might need to travel to Sydney to meet with Australian officials and demonstrate his personal commitment to resolving the issues. The trip would be highly visible, closely watched by media in both countries, and critically important for the future of his foundation's international work. "Miss Parker has suggested that Your Royal Highness might benefit from a detailed briefing on Australian regulatory expectations before the visit," Miss Walsh explained during one of their regular conference calls. "She's prepared a comprehensive overview of local requirements and cultural considerations that could be crucial for the success of your meetings." Charles agreed immediately to the briefing, though his eagerness had as much to do with the possibility of speaking with Camilla as with the practical value of her expertise. The briefing was scheduled for the following day, to take place via secure video conference given the sensitive nature of the legal matters being discussed. When the appointed time arrived, Charles found himself more nervous than he had been before any official engagement in recent memory. His staff had set up the video conference equipment in his private office, ensuring complete privacy and security for the sensitive legal discussions. As the connection was established and the screen flickered to life, Charles held his breath. Camilla appeared on the screen, sitting in what was obviously a conference room in Sydney. She looked professional and composed, her hair pulled back in a style he remembered, wearing a navy blue suit that highlighted her natural elegance. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their shared history creating a charged silence despite the thousands of miles between them. "Your Royal Highness," Camilla said finally, her voice carrying clearly through the technology. "Thank you for taking the time for this briefing. I know how busy your schedule must be." "Miss Parker," Charles replied, struggling to keep his tone appropriately formal, "I'm grateful for your expertise in this matter. Please proceed with your briefing." What followed was perhaps the most professional conversation Charles had ever participated in, and simultaneously the most emotionally charged. Camilla walked him through the intricacies of Australian housing law, explained the cultural sensitivities he would need to navigate, and provided detailed recommendations for his upcoming meetings. Her expertise was evident in every aspect of her presentation, But Charles found himself focusing as much on the familiar cadences of her voice as on the legal information she was providing. Throughout the briefing, both maintained perfect professional decorum, but Charles caught glimpses of the woman he had known and cared for so deeply. The way she paused to ensure he understood a particularly complex point, the slight smile that crossed her face when she explained a regulation that she clearly found amusing in its bureaucratic complexity, the genuine concern in her voice when discussing the welfare of the residents affected by the housing issues. As the briefing drew to a close, Camilla provided him with a detailed written summary of all the points they had discussed. "This should serve as a reference during your meetings," she explained. "If any questions arise that aren't covered in these materials, my colleagues and I will be available for immediate consultation." "Thank you," Charles said, knowing that their professional interaction was ending, but reluctant to break the connection. "Your analysis has been invaluable. I feel much better prepared for the challenges ahead." There was a pause, and for a moment Camilla's professional composure seemed to waver slightly. "Your Royal Highness," she said, her voice softer than it had been during the formal briefing, "I want you to know that the work your foundation does, the commitment you show to helping vulnerable populations, it matters enormously. What happened with the housing facility was unfortunate, but your response, your determination to make things right, that's what defines true leadership." Charles felt his throat tighten with emotion. Through the careful language of professional consultation, Camilla was expressing something far more personal. She was telling him that she believed in him, that she respected not just his title, but the man he had become through their shared commitment to service. "That means more to me than you know," he replied, hoping she would understand that he was thanking her for far more than legal advice. The screen went dark as the connection ended, leaving Charles alone in his office with the echo of Camilla's voice and the realization that, despite everything that separated them, their connection remained as strong as ever. They had found a way to work together again, to combine their talents in service of something larger than themselves. It wasn't the relationship either of them might have chosen, but it was real and meaningful and perhaps enough. The morning of Charles's departure for Sydney dawned clear and bright, though his mood remained clouded with anticipation and uncertainty. The legal crisis had been resolved through weeks of intensive collaboration between London and Sydney, but the success of his upcoming visit would determine whether his foundation could continue its important work in Australia. More personally, he would be in the same city as Camilla for the first time since her departure nearly a year ago. The flight to Sydney seemed endless, providing too many hours for Charles to contemplate what lay ahead. His briefing materials included detailed schedules for meetings with government officials, housing administrators, and representatives from various charitable organizations. Nowhere in the official itinerary was there any mention of Camilla, though Charles knew she would likely be present for at least some of the legal discussions. Upon arriving in Sydney, Charles was struck by the vibrant energy of the city and the warmth of his reception. Australian officials had organized a comprehensive program designed to demonstrate their commitment to working with international charitable organizations while ensuring the highest standards of care for vulnerable populations. The media coverage was extensive but generally positive, focusing on Charles's dedication to addressing the issues raised by the housing facility incident. His first day included meetings with housing ministers, tours of exemplary facilities, and discussions with residents who had benefited from various support programs. Charles found the work engaging and meaningful, but part of his attention remained focused on the possibility of seeing Camilla. Each time he entered a conference room or meeting space, his eyes quickly scanned the assembled participants, searching for her familiar presence. It wasn't until the second day that their paths finally crossed. Charles was participating in a complex negotiation session regarding new safety standards for supported housing, when Camilla entered the conference room with several other legal representatives. She wore a charcoal gray suit and carried herself with the professional confidence he remembered, but Charles could see subtle changes that spoke to her time in Australia. Her skin had acquired a slight tan from the southern hemisphere sun, and there was something different in her posture, a sense of belonging that suggested she had successfully established herself in her new environment. Their eyes met briefly as she took her seat at the conference table, but both immediately focused their attention on the legal documents being discussed. For the next 3 hours, they participated in technical negotiations about building codes, inspection procedures, and resident safety protocols. Charles found himself impressed once again by Camilla's expertise and advocacy for the people affected by housing policies. During a break in the proceedings, Charles found himself standing near the conference room windows, looking out at Sydney Harbor in the distance. The view was spectacular, but his attention was focused on the reflection in the glass that showed Camilla approaching from behind. "Your Royal Highness," she said quietly, positioning herself beside him at the window but maintaining a respectful distance. "Miss Parker," he replied, turning to face her directly for the first time since her departure from London. They stood looking at each other for a moment, both seeming to catalogue the small changes that time and distance had brought. Camilla looked healthy and confident, clearly thriving in her new environment, but Charles thought he detected something wistful in her expression. "You seem to have settled well here," Charles observed, genuine pleasure evident in his voice despite the formal words. "Australia has been good to me," she replied. "The work is challenging and meaningful, and the people have been incredibly welcoming. I found a flat in Paddington with a view of the harbor, and I've even taken up sailing on weekends." Charles smiled at this revelation. "Sailing? I never would have imagined you on the water." For just a moment, Camilla's professional composure softened, and he glimpsed the woman he had known so well in London. "There are many things about this new life that I never would have imagined," she said. "But sometimes the unexpected turns out to be exactly what we need." Their conversation was interrupted by the return of other participants to the conference room, and both immediately reverted to their professional roles. The afternoon session proved productive, with agreements reached on several important points that would strengthen protections for housing facility residents while allowing Charles's foundation to continue its support work. As the formal meetings concluded and participants began to gather their materials, Charles realized this might be his only opportunity for a more private conversation with Camilla. The official reception that evening would be crowded and public, providing no chance for personal discussion. "Miss Parker," he said, approaching her as she organized her legal files, "I wonder if I might have a word with you about some remaining legal questions. Perhaps we could continue our discussion over coffee." Camilla looked up from her documents, and Charles could see her weighing the appropriateness of such a meeting against her obvious desire to accept his invitation. After a moment, she nodded. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. I'd be happy to address any remaining concerns you might have about the legal framework we've established." They left the government building together, with Charles's security detail maintaining a discreet distance as they walked to a quiet cafe overlooking the harbor. The late afternoon sun cast golden light across the water, and the outdoor seating area was relatively private, despite being in public view. Once they were seated with their coffee, the pretense of legal consultation quickly gave way to more personal conversation. They talked about Camilla's adjustment to life in Sydney, her work at the law firm, and the friendships she had begun to form with colleagues and neighbors. Charles shared updates about his continuing charitable work, mutual acquaintances in London, and the changes in his own life since her departure. As their conversation continued, both seemed to relax into the easy familiarity they had once shared. The months of separation hadn't diminished their ability to communicate and connect, though both remained carefully aware of the boundaries that circumstances imposed upon them. "I think about London sometimes," Camilla admitted as they watched sailboats moving across the harbor. "Especially the parks, Hyde Park in autumn, the way the light filters through the trees along the Serpentine. There's something about the quality of English light that you can't find anywhere else." Charles felt his heart constrict at her words. "The parks haven't been the same since you left," he said quietly, then immediately regretted the personal nature of his comment. But Camilla didn't seem disturbed by his admission. Instead, she smiled with what looked like gratitude. "I'm glad to know they're remembered," she said simply. As the sun began to set and the time for evening obligations approached, both seemed reluctant to end their time together. Finally, Charles glanced at his watch and sighed. "I suppose we should return. The reception begins in an hour, and I imagine you have preparations to make." "Yes," Camilla agreed, though she made no immediate move to leave. They walked back toward the city center in comfortable silence, both knowing this interlude represented something precious and finite. At the corner where their paths would diverge, Charles returning to his hotel, Camilla to her flat, they paused. "Miss Parker," Charles said formally, aware that his security detail was within earshot, "thank you for your invaluable assistance with these legal matters. Your expertise has been crucial to our success here." "Thank you, Your Royal Highness," Camilla replied with equal formality. "It has been an honor to work on behalf of your foundation's important mission." They shook hands briefly, a gesture that appeared completely appropriate to any observer, but which allowed them a moment of physical contact, a tangible connection across the distance that separated their lives. As Charles watched Camilla walk away down the Sydney street, her figure eventually disappearing into the crowd of evening commuters, he felt a complex mixture of joy and sadness. Seeing her again had confirmed what he had always known, that their connection transcended time and distance, that the love he felt for her remained as strong as ever. But it had also reinforced the impossibility of their situation, the unbridgeable gap between the life he was required to live and the life he might have chosen. That night, at the official reception, Charles fulfilled his duties with his characteristic grace, speaking eloquently about international cooperation and the importance of charitable work. But as he smiled and conversed with dignitaries and officials, part of his heart remained on that harborside cafe, treasuring the memory of an afternoon when, for just a few hours, the woman he loved had been within reach once again. The next morning, as his plane lifted off from Sydney Airport, Charles watched the city shrink below him and knew that this goodbye might truly be their last. But he carried with him the image of Camilla as he had last seen her, confident, successful, and beautiful in the golden light of an Australian evening, and the knowledge that somewhere in the world, she was living a life that brought her satisfaction and joy. It would have to be enough.